Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. All right, man. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. This is the light analysis of the Richárd Rapport and Alireza Firouzja game. You know, these games have actually been pretty long, so it's really hard to kind of try to condense them down into like 10 to 12 minute sections if you want to try to make sure you cover everything. But I am doing my best to make sure this one is short, so I got you. So for all my people that are coming from the Philippines, I would say Maligayang Pagdating sa my chest, ladies and gentlemen. Anybody who is coming from Hungary, I will say Sia and Kusanem for stopping by. Anybody who is coming from France, I will say bonjour. Merci beaucoup for watching my stuff. Anybody who is coming from Iran, who does speak Farsi, I will say salam and khayli mamnoon. I appreciate you very much. But if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look, see what we have for this game. So we got the move e4. Best by test was what Bobby Fischer said back in the day. We do have c5, so we have the Sicilian defense. We got knight to f3, we got d6, pawn to d4, pawn takes, and then we have queen takes. And this is the Chekhover variation. It is not super common that the queen takes on d4. Almost 100,000 games in the database for knight takes d4. And you get into many things. I mean, you can get into like Najdorfs or dragons or, you know, kind of, you know, Taimanovs, like whatever you want to try to get into in these types of situations. We do see knight to c6. And this is one of the drawbacks of that. You know, taking with the queen on d4, but we do have bishop to b5, which does pin down the knight. You got to do something, because if not, the queen is just going to be lost. So we do see pawn to a6. We got bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, and then we have c4. So we have like a Maroczy bind type situation, just trying to make d5 pawn push as impossible as possible. We do see the move e5, and this is knocking the queen somewhere, so we do go back to d3, a logical square. We do see the move knight to e7, and as early as it is in the game, I do have the part in the video where if you do want to pause the video and see what is the best move in the position for white to play, go ahead and do so. Okay, so I think a majority of you guys will go castles. It's very logical to go castles. I mean, you can go knight to c3, you can go castles. You know, just play like principal type moves, which is all very possible. It's not like you're going to be in a bad position, but the most aggressive and attacking way to play this position is actually to go c5. And black has like a decision that they need to make. Are they going to capture on c5, which kind of causes a little bit of chaos? Or are they just going to go knight to g6, which is the top move? And this is what Firouzja does play. But let's say, for example, you do capture on c5. Of course, you're going to be looking at queen takes d8 with check. The king is going to take only move, and then you're looking at knight takes e5. Not only is the king not capable of castling now, the rook is kind of stuck in the corner, and you are looking at knight to f7 with check, which of course you're going to defend with either bishop to e6 or king over to e8. You got to do something. But like I said, you know, your pieces are kind of stuck in the middle of the board. Your king. Like I said, we do see the knight coming down to g6. Now we don't have to worry about this pawn being taken because the knight is covering it. So we kind of have to do something with this pawn tension. So we do see pawn taking d6, queen taking d6, queen taking d6, bishop taking d6, and we do see the novelty of the game now, which is bishop up to e3. It's a very logical move. You're just developing it, but then also you are looking at this c5 square, you know, as a possible target. You know, if this pawn is pushed, maybe hit something like b3, and you are, you know, trying to gang up on this pawn right here. So we do see the move a5, just an attempt to try to defend the pawn. We got castles by white, f6, you know, just reinforcing the pawn in the center. We do see rook to c1. The first thing that you want to do if you are trying to win an enemy piece is control the square in front of it. You do not want this pawn to move. You want it to be completely immobile so that it can become like a fixed target to hit. So this bishop and this rook are doing a good job at doing that right now. The rook does come to a6. We got to protect that pawn somehow. The knight b comes to d2. We see bishop down to e6. We see knight down to e1. King goes to f7. We see knight to d3. And now this knight is adding its own, you know, protection of that square. So that pawn is literally going nowhere fast. So we do see rook over to d8. attacking the knight that is now undefended on d3. We see the king going over to f1, bishop to b4, discovering an attack on that knight. And then we do see the move king to e2. And it is just in time to make sure that we are good to go to capture, just have the king protect everything, right? So we do see knight to h4. We're not worried about that, though. We see knight taking b4, pawn taking b4, and then we do see the move g3. And we're like, bro, knight, go back where you came from. Like, what are you doing over there? So the knight does go back to g6. We see bishop up to c5, just, attacking this pawn over here. We have to do something, active because this bishop and this rook are both on this a2 square. So we got to do some counterattacking. So we do see the rook going over to b8, and now something has to give. So we see the move a3. We see pawn takes a3, rook takes a3, and then rook b to a8. We're not necessarily wanting to take this rook because the bishop is going to take back. And I mean, everything is pretty much taken care of. And this pawn still isn't moving. So we do see knight to c4, bishop takes c4, rook takes c4. And then we do see knight back to f8. The rook goes over to b3. We're trying to get some penetration up here on the 7th rank. We do see a knight coming down to e6. Rook goes to b7 with check. We see king back to g8. Bishop comes down to e3 in an effort to try to preserve it. But as you guys will see coming up, that is very short-lived. We do see rook over to d8. We got f4, and then we do see knight to d4 with check. And this is actually knocking the king quite a bit. So we need to take on d4 with the bishop. Pawn takes d4, and then we do see king over to d2. Rook comes down to a1. We see the rook taking on c6, but, black is going to get their own counterplay, and that's what they're trying to do is just activate their pieces. Rook c goes to c7, and I mean, this is looking kind of good, man. I'm not going to lie to you. It's looking pretty nice. The rook takes on h2 with check. The king goes up to d3. We see g6, and then we actually see the move e5 in the game. Now, something else that was possible is just going rook to g7 check immediately. And then after the king sidesteps over to h8, just starting to get this b pawn rolling with b4. We would see probably rook to h3, and we are attacking this pawn. But we're not worried about it because once you take my pawn, I'm going to take your pawn. So we just sidestep out of the way of that check. And then we do see the move d3. And we have to do something with this pawn. So both of our rooks are on the right spot to be able to contest this. So we would see rook g to d7. Rook would go over to e8, counterattacking. King would take on d3. Rook takes g3 with check. The king goes up to d4. We see rook over to h3, and then we see b5. And as you can see, that pawn is getting dangerously close to the promised land. So this is a very, very dominant position for white to have. But like I said, we do not see that. After we see the move g6, we do see the move e5. Pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5. We do see rook up to h3. Similar ideas from what I said. The king comes up to e4. Rook takes g3. We do see rook taking g7 or rook to g7 with check. King goes to h8. Rook takes h7 with check. The king goes over to g8. We see king over to f4, just tickling that rook, seeing what it wants to do. And then we do see rook moving over to e3. Perfect anchor square. The rook b goes to g7 with check. We see king over to f8. We see the rook to f7 with check. King goes back to g8. We see rook f to g7 with check again. The king goes back to f8. We see rook to f7. King goes back to g8. And to make sure that we do not repeat moves, we see a rook h coming over to g7, and we're checking that way. The king sidesteps over to h8, and then we now take the pawn on g6. And we are just up a pawn. It's not completely winning. I mean, you definitely have some resources as black. So we do see rook down to e2. We see the move e6 because, man, we're trying to push this pawn. If black does nothing, we can push this pawn again, and then we can check here. We're doing somewhat, pretty good. So the rook does come over to e8. We see rook to h6 with check. The king goes over to g8. The rook goes back to g6 with check. King goes back to h8. We do see rook f to f6, and we are just doubly protecting this pawn. And this rook really doesn't want to go over and start grabbing pawns because you are going to allow the king to start to get into a more superior position. And the slight problem with black's position is that they are a little bit disconnected with their rooks. So their rooks aren't really working together like you really want them to. So this pawn is kind of like, dividing them up. So the rook does come to e7. We see b4. We got d3. Rook comes down to g3. You're thinking about going over to d3 to just protect that queening square, maybe win the pawn. So we do see d2. We see rook to h6 with check. And then we see rook to h7, only move. Rook takes h7 with check, king takes h7, and then we do see the rook over to d3. We see the king down to g6, the king goes down to f3. We see rook takes e6, rook takes d2. We see the king over to f6. We see the king up to f4, opposing the king. Rook goes down to e1. The rook comes up to d4. We see king over to e6, and we do have a draw by agreement. The issue that you have in this position, the reason why it is drawn is because this king is just slightly too far away from the queenie square of this pawn, and this king is in like a much better position. And the problem is either side, you don't really want to give with your rook because you're going to allow either one of these kings to start coming this way. So you're pretty much in a position where you just have to kind of keep, hold of the position as it is. Like I said, if this king was maybe over here or even over in this area, then you can achieve a Lucena position. But because it is completely cut off and it is too far away, a lot farther than this king, there is no way for white to achieve that position unless black allows them to. And the rook can always come behind, and it makes it pretty impossible to push this pawn, of course, because you can't put this rook up here. And the king, like I said, is just a little bit too far away. So king position super duper matters. That is definitely something to keep in mind when you're playing your games. But man, 7 minutes I shaved off the off the video. It's good that I'm able to piggyback and on a video that I already made, and I can pretty much just kind of simplify it down so I can make sure that people that want to see a much quicker game can actually look at the game. So I appreciate you guys very much. My people in the Philippines, maraming salamat aking makaibigan. Anybody who is coming from Hungary, I will say kusenem. Anybody who is coming from France, merci beaucoup, mes amis. Anybody who is coming from Iran, khayli mamnoon. And I'll see you guys next time.